Hi, my name is Elizabeth Weaver, and I'm a senior in MSCC at Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, and I'm here today to present to you my capstone research project. The official title of my project is Analyzing the Effectiveness of the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism List as a Diplomatic Tool Against Terrorism, and I worked under the mentorship of Dr. Jesse Johnson in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kentucky. To give you an overview of how my presentation is going to go, first we're going to go into background, then the purpose and hypothesis of this exploratory study, then my methodology, the data I collected, my results, conclusions and further research, and finally my acknowledgments, references, and leave an opening for any questions. To give you some background as to why this research is important and why I specifically picked this topic, it is important to know first the background of diplomacy and its efforts with counterterrorism. So since 2001 in the war on terror after 9/11, we have seen that diplomacy has become increasingly important in counterterrorism efforts as a whole. Of course, we still see the importance of, the more traditional methods of counterterrorism, which includes military interventions, meeting with leaders, stuff like that. But what we have seen is that diplomatic actions such as negotiations, sanctions, etc., have had some impact on counterterrorism and have had a good amount of effectiveness with that. But when we get into numerical data and analyzing how certain specific forms of diplomacy have been used in counterterrorism, such as lists, we can see that there's little to no data as far as how effective certain types of diplomacy are. This is especially true when we look at the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism list or just diplomatic lists in general, as there's pretty much no data onto whether or not these lists are actually effective in reducing terrorism in the countries they are implemented within. To give you some background on the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism list, and specifically what I am analyzing, this is a list that was created in 1979 by the federal government as a way to try and reduce state-sponsored terrorism. Now, state-sponsored terrorism is kind of what it is and what it sounds like. State-sponsored terrorism is when an official government of a foreign nation, or just really any nation overall, actually supports terror groups through multiple ways and for a multitude of reasons. Now, supporting terror groups can mean a multitude of different things, such whether it's putting money into them, giving them trained fighters, giving them training, giving them weapons, access to technology, etc. There's a number of ways that these foreign nations can support these terror groups. And there are also a number of reasons why these nations support these terror groups, whether it's they share the same common goal or ideology. You can see sometimes that they share a common enemy that they want taken out, whether that's a specific person or an entire nation as a whole. So the goal of this list is to when a country is put on this list, a number of diplomatic punitive measures are implemented. That way, it will hopefully reduce their support of these terror groups and therefore reduce global terrorism as a whole. The number of punitive measures there's a big range of punitive measures that are taken once a nation is placed on this list, which includes stuff such as embargoes on trade. We see certain sanctions, and one of the big ones is a ban on selling or exporting or taking weapons from a certain nation that is placed on this list. The main point of this list, though, is that none of the measures taken are military action, and they are all strictly diplomatic in their nature. This means that what it is trying to do basically is use just solely diplomacy as a method of hopefully reducing terrorism. So to get into my purpose and hypothesis, the purpose of this study is, again, since it's exploratory, it is simply determining if the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism list is actually an effective tool in reducing global terrorism. After doing my background research and literature review, I came to my initial hypothesis that due to the limitations of the punitive actions taken from this list and often the economic power and military might of the certain foreign nations that are placed on this list will not be effective in reducing global terrorism. So basically, we will not see a reduction in the amount of global terror incidents that stem from the groups supported by these nations. To get into my methodology, first, let's break it down into what I actually analyzed. So overall, there were 7 nations I analyzed within my data, which were Iran, Iraq, Cuba, Syria, Sudan, Libya, and North Korea. Now, these are all nations that are currently either on the list or have been on the list at some point, then taken off. There was also, South Yemen was also on the list in the 80s and 90s, but I did leave them off of my study and did not include them in my data collection as there was a lack of credible data as far as which terror groups they supported, why they were placed on the list, etc. So I left them off as to prevent any false data from being put into my study and from screwing up the data. From there on, I then assigned a time period for data collection for each individual nation, which that was just simply when they were on the list. So for, let's say, Syria, my time period of data collection was from 1979 to 2018 because they have been on the list ever since its creation, never taken off. So because of that, that was a time period I collected for. From then on, I did a literature review and looked specifically into, using background research, which terror groups each nation specifically supported, and to try and find the specific terror groups to analyze data for. Continuing on, I want to speak about the database that I used. So the data was collected from the Global Terrorism Database, which I will refer to as the GTD, which is provided by the University of Maryland. This is a database that's been tracking every global terror incident since 1970 and includes an important amount of data, especially they list the perpetrator group, if confirmed, that supported that terror group, which is great because that allowed me to figure out which terror group supported which attacks and how many terror attacks came from that group. So the overall time period, when I summed it all up from my data collection, was from 1979 to 2018, as 1979 was the creation of the list, and December 31st, 2018 is the last database update that we have from this database, as I have still not updated their data for 2019. So from then on, I then created an individualized data collection sheet for each nation. So each of the 7 nations I had their own data Excel spreadsheet to collect data for. From then on, I made sure to have them their assigned time period for collection. So Syria, 1979-2018, and it went like that for all the groups. And I then separated within that data sheet, I then had separate columns set out for each of the terror groups they supported. So for Iran, you had the Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, stuff like that. They had separate columns within that country's data sheet. That way I could see the changes in just a single perpetrator group over time and separate it out by perpetrator group within the nation. Not working. I don't know why it's not working. Okay, so there we go. From then on, my methodology continued after collecting all that data and sorting through over 16,000 different events by hand. I then went into my data analysis. So from there on, I analyzed the individual group and terror nation combinations using the statistical software program called JAST. This is a software program that is used a lot by social science projects to try and help them determine their data. What I used specifically was the Pearson correlational coefficient matrix, which results in a Pearson's R value and a p-value. What I put in there was the specific terror group and the change in terror attacks over time as that nation was on the list. So with that Pearson's R value and p-value, my R value was my correlational value, basically how strong the correlation of change is. If it's positive, that means there's an increase, and negative, there's a decrease in terrorism. And the closer it is to either 1 or -1, that is how strong the correlation and how big of a change there was. The p-value is my statistical significance value, which I'm sure some of you guys have taken AP stats, but if you have not, my p-value helps me determine whether or not the data is statistically significant and if I should count it in my results. Since this was run at a 95% confidence interval, that means that my p-value had to be at 0.05 or below in order to count it as statistically significant. From then on, once I had analyzed all of the data and seen the R values and P values, I then sorted it into my significant versus insignificant groups. Beyond that, within my significant groups, I then sorted those into an increase versus decrease in terrorism. So basically, if there's a positive or a negative P value, or R value. So here is actually the data I collected. This is my first data table. On the left, you can see the nation, and by their name in parentheses is a number, and that is the number of terror groups I analyzed within that nation. So Iran had 5, North Korea 2, Syria 5, Sudan 7, Iraq 7, Cuba 2, and Libya 13, my greatest amount of groups, which resulted in a total of 41 groups analyzed. In the next column over, we see the percentage of groups with insignificant results. And then in the next column next to that, we see the percentage of groups with significant results. So as you can see by this data, we had about 49%, so split pretty evenly, half and half. 49% had insignificant results, while 51% had significant results when we counted out the data. This is my next data table, and this is when we look specifically into just the significant groups we saw, so those 21 to 41 groups. So on the left, again, it is the same format. We have the nation, and that is, in parentheses, is the number of significant groups I analyzed. So I took out all of the insignificant groups from my initial data analysis. From then, in the next column, we have the percentage of significant groups with an increase of terrorism. So while they were on the list, there was an increase in terror incidents within the nations, within the groups. And then in the next column over, we see the percentage of significant groups with a decrease in terrorism, which again is the overall goal of this list, to decrease terrorism. And we can see here the number of groups that had a decrease in terrorism. So just of the significant groups, we had about 21 groups analyzed total, with 38% showing a significant increase in terrorism and 62% showing a significant decrease in terrorism, which is that intended goal. Now that seems like a pretty good number, but let's get into what it actually means as a whole. So again, my results, we had about half and half. So 21 of the 41 groups had a significant change. Well, 20 out of the 41 were insignificant change in global terrorism as a whole while these nations were on the list. Beyond that, of the significant changes, we saw about 13 of the groups had a decrease, that intended goal, and about 8 of the 21 groups had an increase in terrorism while they were on the list. So when it was just done a simple proportion as far as that meant that overall about 13 of the 41 groups, or just 31%, saw a significant decrease in terrorism for the time period while the nation was on the list. Now, as far as what this data actually means, and when we look into conclusions of this study and the discussion, what we deemed as the effectiveness of the list, we seem to deem it overall as pretty low when we looked into it, due to the fact that it only had about a 31% success rate when we looked into it. Even beyond that, we only saw about half of the groups see a significant change, which means that it's about a 1 in 2 chance that there will even be some form of change, whether it's an increase or decrease, if a nation is placed on this list. So this means that overall my initial hypothesis was actually supported, as there was just not an effective tool in reducing global terrorism as a whole. But when we actually look specifically into nation versus nation, we can see that there is some discrepancy as far as support for my hypothesis, because North Korea, both of the groups I analyzed for there, had a significant decrease in terrorism, meaning that it was completely a success there. But then when we look into Iran, there was a significant change in terrorism for all the groups, but about 4 out of 5 groups, or 80% of the groups, saw a significant increase in terrorism. So it seems to imply that it varies from nation by nation, and that there's potentially a certain criteria of a nation that must be met in order for success for this group. So as far as further studies and what I would like to see this data be used, I would love to see this data be used to investigate why certain countries saw success and maybe what criteria must be met in order for this list to be effective. You know, it seems after collecting this data and analyzing it, that there are certain conditions from a nation that must be met in combination with this list in order for the list to actually have any positive effect in reducing global terrorism as a whole, and reducing terrorism that stems from that nation's support of terror groups. So hopefully this analysis and this data will lead to an increased understanding of counterterrorism efforts, and specifically diplomacy, because again, diplomacy is going to become very important. We cannot be getting, military use is becoming harder and harder due to the fact that we are increasingly being left with nuclear options, and of course no one wants to have nuclear war, so diplomacy is becoming very, very important in counterterrorism. Hopefully this data and understanding these and using these further studies to look at criteria for success will increase the effectiveness of diplomacy, and hopefully increase the use of effective counterterrorism as a whole. For my acknowledgments, I would like to thank Dr. Jesse Johnson, my mentor, for helping me through this research and guiding me. I would like to thank the University of Kentucky, and specifically the Department of Political Science, for allowing me guidance and a place to do my research. I would love to thank the Kentucky Young Researchers Program for allowing me this opportunity. Same with MSTC, the Math Science Technology Center in Dunbar. I would love to thank them for giving me the opportunity to perform this amazing research. And then my friends and family for supporting me throughout the way in this stressful time period and helping me with my research. Here are my references as far as what I mentioned in this presentation. And I will leave the floor open for questions. Of course, that is something we cannot do right now, so feel free to email me at elizabeth.weaver@stu.fayette.kyschools.us. Thank you very much.